All right. So I was talking just before I paused about patterns and iteration in our performances and whether maybe this is where selfhood is. This takes us all the way back to Nietzsche, who we talked about at the very beginning of the class, right? Nietzsche on the notion of eternal return, which is not a part of Nietzsche that we focused on so far. Nietzsche had this idea that in order for us to feel the existential weight of the decisions we make, we needed to think of them as decisions that you would be condemned to make over and over again, infinite times until eternity. And he asked, with each decision, you need to ask yourself, is this a decision that you would be happy with remaking every time you face it over and over again as your life loops around? Or will you regret this decision? And this was his way, as most people read him, of trying to find a sense of momentousness to the decisions we make. Because at each moment it can feel like, well, this is just, I'm just choosing in the moment. But if you have this feeling that your choice has this indefinite temporal extension to it, that it will be with you forever, then these choices feel existentially weighty. Why do we want them to feel existentially weighty? Well, remember, for Nietzsche, an existentialist, what you choose and what you do just is who you are. So you are making yourself when you choose, and this was his way of getting this across. It seems to me like the show is playing with Nietzsche's parable of the eternal return and in a way reversing it. Instead of saying choose as if you choose an infinite number of times and make the same choice, it's saying what if that's the way that we actually are, is we make the same choice over and over again whether or not we want to, and so we're stuck with that existential heaviness whether or not we want it. This is, I think, almost made explicit by the reporters who follow Bojack around throughout season 6, right? With respect to Sarah Lynn's death, the reporters repeat over and over again, and in case the reader didn't notice it's important, they keep repeating it. The language is really repetitive. The reporters say that this is how they think about responsibility. The question for them, the story, is this a pattern that Bojack has with women? They don't care about it if it's a single isolated incident. It doesn't make a story for them. It's only a story for them if it's a pattern. And they keep hammering away at this point. Can we show that this is a pattern? Can we show that Bojack's interactions with women form a pattern here? When he does the interview, the same thing happens. They want to know not specifically what happened with Sarah Lynn, but is this a pattern? And the language of story here is really useful for us, right? The reason that the reporters are talking about a story is because they want to write a news story. But it's a way of sending us back to the narrative theory of identity, I think, to use this language of story over and over again. When they tell us there's only a story if there's a pattern, they're telling us something about which sort of narrative counts for existential purposes, right? The narrative that is your identity is the narrative on this reading that includes a pattern that you reiterate through your performances over and over again. And that's what we want to know about Bojack. What is his pattern? Is his time sober and well-behaved just a little bit of a blip, time off from the pattern, or is it the start of a new pattern? That's really the question of accountability here on my reading of the show. Again, I don't think there's one single reading, but it feels to me like this is where the show puts most of its existential weight to the extent that it comes down. Right? So Sarah Lynn's death then is his responsibility, and he's accountable for it if it's part of a pattern which makes up his performances that he reiterates. If not, then we don't have as clear of an existential case of responsibility on our hands. This can be a way of thinking about all of his selfhood, right? It's not any one performance or any one part of your narrative that makes you you, and it's not your internal essence that makes you you. It's the patterns that you iterate and perform again and again that make you you. And I'd actually like you to think about this in your own life. This, again, is something that would be nice to talk about on the discussion board. I'm not requiring it, but I'd like to suggest it. Are you more responsible for something you do if it's the kind of thing you do routinely? And conversely, if you do something that's out of character, does that get you off the hook, right? Are you less responsible for it because it wasn't in keeping with your patterns? Now, if you believe in an essential self, you're of course going to say yes. You're going to say, my essential self has a certain character, And if I act out of that character, then that's not really me, so it's not my problem. But if we don't believe in an essential self, if we believe that we exist in our actions, then I think we have a much harder question on our hand, which is, does the fact that we repeat an action make us more responsible for any one instance of that action? Or are we just as responsible if we do something one time and it's not part of a pattern, given that that's still a performance? That all came out really abstract. The concrete question I want you to ask yourself is, think about something that you've done wrong which fits in with a pattern of wrongdoing. And think about something else that you've done wrong, a time that you caused harm, which was out of character for you. Do you think you were less responsible for the out of character thing? And why or why not? Another little piece of evidence we have that the show is coming down in favor of Bojack being a creature who is created through his iterations and repetitions is the language that he used of being a Xerox of a Xerox, right? Which is literally this image of repetition and self-iteration. Now, he goes on to reject that and he says he's not that anymore. But precisely what we're questioning here is if he's right. Okay, that's really what I wanted to say about this, although I do want to just make one separate point about narrative identity because it's moving enough that I think it requires us to take a moment to acknowledge it. And that's the fact that he gets written out of horsing around, right? That they remove him from that narrative. That defining performance that he did again and again, right? Play this character over and over and over again, the horse on horsing around. Notice the horse never has a name, right? It's just the horse on horsing around. But that was a character that he iterated over and over for years and a defining performance of who he is. For him to lose that and have that taken away from him, for them to remake the show without him in it when he was the central figure in it and the show was so defining of his identity, that feels like the most movingly brutal hit, arguably, that Bojack takes from an emotional and from an existential point of view, doesn't it? I mean, lots of bad stuff happens to him and he undergoes a lot of loss and a lot of it is very moving. But from an existential point of view, writing him out of horsing around feels like the biggest gut punch, at least to me. And on this performative, iterative theory of identity, that makes sense. That's really an erasure of self, which goes beyond any of the other kinds of losses that he undergoes. Okay, and that takes us to our last two lectures. And the next lecture is going to be on episode 15. I said this online, but please make sure that you watch episode 15 when you're in a good state of mind, because it's arguably the emotionally most difficult episode of the whole series. So be prepared. Okay, talk to you next time.